Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who is looking at the moment and watching us in the Urban Dialogues series. This is the second one of the year, and I'm very happy to have two wonderful guests here that will be speaking to us, and we have a dialogue, of course, with them on the issue of how we can use the wealth of Indigenous knowledge, how to inspire us when making and creating the city. In the announcement, we had a third person that was joining us, but unfortunately, she couldn't make it in the morning. So we are here with the three of us, and hopefully we'll enjoy this webinar. So talking about Indigenous knowledge, First Nations peoples knowledge that is somewhat different from the Western viewpoint, I guess, and our two speakers will touch on that. The main question of today would be something about how we actually can make a difference in the city and to the lives of the people that live in the city, if we take Indigenous knowledge as the basis for how we create the city, how we make the city, and also the land around and beneath it. So I think it is a very timely discussion that we have, given all the problems and the changes that are coming at us at the moment from the more Western type of thinking, focus on the economy and growth all the time, and how we should look at that. So I'm very glad to introduce to you Dominique Hess and Jason Twill. Dominique, she's at the moment in Sydney in Australia, and it's very early in her part of the world, 6 a.m. So welcome and thank you for getting up so early, Dominique. Jason Twill is in Seattle at the moment, so he's more or less in the same time zone as Mexico. And I know there is a lot of people from Europe watching as well, and they're more or less 10 or 9 p.m. in the evening. So there are many different time zones. We hope to keep you awake or make you awake or stay awake during this discussion. So what I think is a good way to start this discussion is how we can look at, let's say, the connection between what has been called the soil, the soul, and society. So what's in the soil is something that is got to do with the animals, the plants, the rocks, the mountains, the rivers, everything that has a right and intrinsic value of its own. They all have a soul, and more importantly, they all are part of a global community. So it's not only about humans that decide or think about that, but the relationship between those three elements is very important. I think it is good to start with the both perspectives and introductions of both Dominique and Jason, and listen to them. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. You can put them in the Q&A, and we will see them on our screen, so we can direct the questions to the right people and discuss it. Dominique, do you want to start your presentation? You probably have a PowerPoint of another presentation that you want to share your screen.
No. I was just going to speak.
Okay, that's right.
If you want me to show some pretty pictures, then I was because I was thinking this was the dialogue, but I can do that while Jason's having a chat. I can rustle up some slides.
Whatever you feel comfortable with. I will just introduce you a little bit. So Dominique is originally Dutch, so that's there's a link between the two of us. But for a long time, working and living in Australia, most of the time in Melbourne, in Australia, where we met for the first time. So it's very good to see you again, Dominique. At the moment, she is the lead person in the city of Melbourne when it comes to zero carbon buildings. So a very important issue, of course, for all of us that are thinking about and around climate change. One of the interesting things that I think is important to mention is that Dominique has been working on not only knowledge and theory, but also put that in practice. And I think that connection between theory and practice is very important from maybe two perspectives: the more rational side of thinking, but also the more, let's say, the oral side of learning and the approach how that could work out. So Dominique, very much welcome, and love you to hear, listen to you. Please, the floor is yours, and share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, everybody. Now, I have to say, I did my best to I got into an Uber at 5 a.m. this morning to get to somewhere with good Wi-Fi, and I've been blocked. So I'm now on my phone, which doesn't have a lot of Wi-Fi. So I may at times turn my screen off. But I would like to start today. I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney. Usually I'm on the lands of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung. But I'm not Indigenous, and I am just sitting at their feet, learning from their wisdom. And so it's very important for me to do this from a point of humbleness and from a point of acknowledgement of their 2,000 generations of knowledge building on this country, on caring for this country, on they call country the boss. Country is the boss. Country is family. Country is everything. And it is from that perspective that I think it's really important to think about the city and how do we bring that sense of responsibility and love of country, of place into our citizens, because once we do that, we change how we live, how we work, how we participate in the system. So as Rob said, I have Germanic history. I can track my generations back to the von Hesses in Germany, back in Napoleon's time. So very, very much rooted in the place, and very sad to have never grown up there or known that country apart from short visits. I have spent since 1990, I can't even speak, here down in Melbourne. And so that would be probably the country I would call most home. And I live by the waters of the Maribyrnong or the Miranganay-Benong in local language. And I'm starting to learn a little bit about local language, and in there is power as well, in that the people that live, the smaller tribe that live in my area were the river dwellers, and the name for them meant yam hunters as well as river dwellers. So they ate fish, they lived off the shells of the land, and yams were grasses that grew in the area. So it was a grassland and river plains. And so we get to learn a little bit about country in the naming of things. One of the things that I've been really, really interested in, and that Rob has asked me to speak to, is this idea that Indigenous knowledge is expansive, it is collaborative, it is contributing part of a living ecosystem. Whereas, and that's much more ecological thinking. Whereas Western thinking is much more mechanistic thinking. It's breaking problems down. It's understanding the bits and pieces, trying to optimize those bits and pieces to try and solve problems. So the number of times that I'm sure you've all had the conversation where people say, well, let's break down the problem and deal with the bits that we can deal with. Whereas Indigenous knowledge is much more expansive. Let's look at the whole. Let's broaden conversation. Let's really observe place. And in those different knowledges, the oral knowledge of Indigenous people and the literate knowledge of our Western societies, there is a difference in how we build relationship with knowledge. So in an oral society, you sit around the campfire, you listen to the stories, and you have to be completely present with the stories to understand the lessons and the knowledge that you then go out and practice. And you have to learn over time, at least, as I have been taught here in Indigenous Australia, you have to be able to repeat that story, and once you're able to repeat that story, then you are initiated to the next level. So every story, whether it's a simple story of a nut or a tree. Can I come closer to the, I don't know, can I? So whether you have those, I've lost my train of thought now. So you have that different relationship with knowledge in the oral tradition because of the way you're present with it and your responsibility to know that story well so that you can pass it on to others to then learn the next level of that story. In Western society, we learn through reading, we learn to go to a book, go to a source, and go to finding things that confirm our ideas, that confirm, you know, the number of times I've read an academic book start to finish is maybe that many. Including my own, even though I wrote it, I don't think I've ever read it through properly. I go to bits and pieces to find the bits and pieces that I need for my argument, for my thoughts, to build my narrative. And that means I'm never getting hold of the whole story. I never build that relationship. I'm consuming the knowledge. I'm not learning that whole story so that I can pass on that whole story. And that means that we lose the richness of all of the knowledge that comes with that bit that we're looking for. And that leads to very different decisions. In fact, we've seen that in science, that literate knowledge, because we know our brain's plastic, right? And it changes shape depending on how we're learning. Our brain will actually build stronger pathways if we're learning a particular way. And so with our literate reductionist way of thinking, our brain's hardwired to, whenever we see a problem, whenever we see a nail, we pick up the hammer. It's built that path. And so if we want to be able to be more regenerative, if we want to be more Indigenous of place, we, including myself, need to learn more of that expansive thinking. We need to build the neural pathways that are more regenerative, that are more of the place, of more of country. And that's a journey of a lifetime and probably several generations to gain that back. So there's my intro. Over to you, Rob, and over to you, Jason.
I think really interesting, Dominique, and sometimes your sound is a bit gone because of your connection, but I think we get the point of what you were bringing to us today, and maybe I can ask you one question, because we also talk about how that affects the way we look at the city, and we are used to our Western type of thinking, so breaking down problems, seeing everything as a sectoral thing, and then we have a solution for the mobility problem, but we maybe not have a solution for the water problem. So we don't look at those issues and topics, and there are many more, of course, in coherence. How would that look like, in your opinion, if we use the more oral tradition that comes from Indigenous people?
Again, I'm only on the start of this journey, and I don't want to sound like I know anything about this. I'm hoping this works better now that I've got my screen off. Can I just get a thumbs up that my sound is better?
Yeah,
great.
I think so. Yeah.
Great. So just a quick recap if you didn't hear it. If you have more literate knowledge, then you tend to think more in breaking things down and more mechanistically. If you've got more oral knowledge, then you're thinking more expansively and you're thinking more ecologically. When we're talking about regenerative development or developing a city so that it is continuing and thriving within that paradigm of regenerative development, what we want to do is encourage more of that ecological type thinking, so more of that oral type thinking, connected living systems thinking. How we bring that into our knowledge systems of the city is really doing what great thinkers such as Carol Sanford and Regenerative and others in the area, Daniel Christian-Wall and others are all talking about, which is understanding the things that create thriving within a system, understanding the flows that bring life, understanding how to build the capacity of the city so that it can adapt to things. So instead of trying to fix your mobility problem or your water problem or your air quality problem or your pollution problem, all of these things, if you elevate that discussion to how do we support the city to thrive and everyone within it to have agency and connection to place, that ecological thinking, then new solutions come up that often create the capacity for all of the other solutions to be solved. So I'll give a much simpler example, if that's okay, with your forbearance, Jason and Rob, which is bullying. So we have bullying in schools, right? And we can bring in lots of programs to stop bullying in schools. We can, send kids to detention. We can call their parents. We can expel them. But you're not really dealing with the reasons for that bullying. And if instead you have a conversation at a school around what do you love about the school? How do you feel that you can contribute to the school? What would you like to see in place in the school to support who you are as the person, so that you feel really happy and secure at the school? If you start developing the programs to support that whole of school thriving, then not only does the bullying tend to go away, instead of going underground, it goes away, but you also, your littering problem goes away, your graffiti problem goes away, your rudeness in class not completely goes away, but it becomes a lot less because people suddenly have a connection to place. They start understanding the place and how their role is within the place. And we need to bring that sort of thinking into the city. I'm doing that myself with my zero carbon building strategy. As much as I don't use the words regenerative, I don't use the words oral knowledge, but what I'm building is community, that capacity to work together to solve a problem. I hope that helps, Rob.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dominique, for your insights. And I think in the discussion later on, we will build on that further. Let me introduce Jason Twill to all the viewers. Jason is from the US, but he has spent many years in different countries. We first met in Sydney in Australia as well. And he has spent quite some years in Qatar doing very valuable work. His kind of viewpoint, I always enjoyed talking to him, is about how to connect, let's say, sociology, ecology, and the economy as a sort of pathway to really transform the world into something that is, let's say, reducing climate change and global warming, and trying to get the more ecologically based thinking into urban development processes. Jason, apart from you're one of the founders of the International Living Futures Institute, you're also have your own consultancy and called the Urban Apostles, which I think is a great title for a company that's your own. So that's fantastic. If you want to share a screen, please do. If you just want to talk like Dominique did, that's also fine. Please share your thoughts with us and let us know what you're thinking.
Thank you, Rob. It's good to see you. Thanks for asking Dominique and I to share and contribute to this conversation today. It's wonderful to hear you, Dom. And Dom and I are old friends. They're connected through the regenerative practitioner movement, which I'll get into in a minute. And before I begin, acknowledging that I have been given permission to share some insights on this topic as a white man from New York City. According to cultural protocols, I asked permission from a lot of elders that have taught me some insights on this topic that I have permission to share with you today. But it's really kind of looking at it from the lens of the role that a non-Indigenous person has in developing their own capacity to be in service to this topic, how to really understand how to work in service to Indigenous rights, Indigenous causes, how to be safeguarding Indigenous knowledge and wisdom that you are gifted with. So, there's a lot of protocols and a lot of authorities in that. So I'm here, by permission to share some of those insights, as I know Dom would be as well. So I've been an urban redevelopment practitioner and real estate development finance, very conservatively trained in New York. But kind of the first crack in my mind, and Dominique mentioned kind of rewiring neural pathways in our brain to really see the world with different eyes. The first time my brain was cracked, I was shopping for t-shirts in St. Mark's Place in the East Village as like a teenager, and saw a t-shirt that I bought that day that had a picture of Chief Seattle on it, whether he was, the quote was, "The earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth." Whether that's contested if he said that or not, that statement really planted a seed in my mind, which has been now about 25 years of actively being curious and seeking to learn and understand Indigenous ways of knowing and worldviews different than how I was educated in a very Western, American-centric settler state context. And that means there's, behind what I'm talking about today is like 20 years of reading new ways of reinterpreting history, different ways of understanding settler and colonization, what led to, the way the world is working today and how it arrived at that point, and actively seeking mentorship and learnings from First Peoples across the Americas and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even the Arabic worlds that I've lived in the Middle East. To the point now where I don't feel comfortable practicing what I do in a place until I properly engaged with local custodians and learned a deep history of that place, understand how to bring that to a contemporary context if I'm working on guiding a mayor or a city on the urban strategy or a developer, how we can authentically integrate this knowledge, be it through visual attribution of how Indigenous knowledge of a place, which in regenerative practice we call place source potential, can manifest into an architectural vernacular and an urban identity, and how do you create a deeper sense of belonging in place that goes back pre-settlement, that integrates Western and Indigenous contexts together, but also traditional ecological technologies and practices that are many times in my experience are more superior than a Western scientific approach to ecological restoration or food, energy, water, or design. But a lot of the, what I'm seeing at a macro level across the world is this kind of beautiful resurgence on the value, respect, and application of Indigenous knowledge globally. I'm seeing that. I just was at a retreat in New York with a bunch of elders across the Americas region, and one of which who couldn't join us today is Uria, who's a Mayan medicine practitioner. That there is this kind of universal pattern that I see happening of the role that Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological practices can play in parallel with and integrated with Western science to solve the polity crises that we're dealing with. Climate change, social inequality, land governance, and a lot of this goes down to Western notions of land as a commodity to be privately owned versus land as a commons to be, community stewarded. That is the biggest thing. I think that's the heart of the challenge we're dealing with today in 2023, and how we get to where we need to be to a regenerative world, is that really fundamental shift in how we understand the role of land. Like law of land is what Dominique was getting at earlier, which I learned. But where they also it's really powerful, and Dominique mentioned regenerative practitioners. She mentioned Carol Sanford, Pamela Mang. I mean, I have to pay homage to the mentors that I learned, regenerative practitioner training from many, many, many years, like 20 years of learning, or I'd say 20 years of unlearning. And I think that educational model that's really training Western educated thinkers to really shift their mindset and develop a new nature of mind that is starting to really powerfully reconnect Westerners with First Peoples, because we're not as advanced thinking along this. Like I would say I'm a third grader, but it's definitely opened up a whole new dialogue and narrative with First Peoples. And I saw that very powerfully come to fruition in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in Australia. And there's, initiatives that Dominique's involved in that I was helping be in service to, like Regenerative Songlines, because we've been trained to think, practice, and speak a certain way about sustainability that's much more aligned to the ideologies and worldviews of living cultures like Aboriginal Australia or Maori in New Zealand. We can have a different discourse with them that's more understanding the power of their way of thinking about land and ecosystems and living systems, and how we integrate those into contemporary urban development practices. Some really tangible examples of that are, I have a partnership with the Gambanger Aboriginal Systems Ecologist. Her name is Charles Marshall. And we were, we developed this concept of cultural reciprocity and how I was contributing what I was learning as a practitioner in regenerative development and design. And I do say, when I left Seattle, and I'm from New York, I lived in Seattle, yes, living building challenge, all this net zero stuff. So I probably came to Australia, which I would consider as a PhD in sustainability. But when I started learning from elders about, country, deep country, and understanding to see the world through new eyes, I like to tell people I got kicked back to kindergarten. When I say that I now 9 years of learning and being allowed to learn certain things, I'm probably in 3rd grade. So I'm still a kid boy trying to figure out the world. But there is tremendous, it's much more progressed, I believe, in New Zealand, probably the most progressed, Australia, secondly, and then Canada. There's still a long ways to go here in the United States, but there is some headway happening here. The New South Wales Government Architect's Office, when it gets into now urban design, and it gets into a larger systemical question of whether, you read Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk, and you get into whole notions of like nomadic versus sedentary. What's the right model for human settlement and civilization, and all these different models, depending on where you are geographically in the world. But the New South Wales state government has, and I'm going to send Rob a list of resources of the things I'm talking about, so you have links to go to all these things. The New South Wales government has a government architect's office. That is an important thing. Like most countries don't have, or states have, government architect's office. In that government architect's office is a Aboriginal architect and practitioner. And he has a lot of influence and clout on how the state of New South Wales is conceiving their built environment. And there is a document and a volume of work happening called Connecting the Country. I had the privilege of being in service of supporting that document, knowing that there's a myriad of cultural protocols and knowledge keepers in different parts of Australia that have created the blueprint for that document, and case studies on how knowledges like those on place in Gadigal land in Sydney or others can come into beyond just tokenistic acknowledgement through art or symbolism or naming recognition, but fundamentally change how we develop a response to the built environment and built urbanity, be it through ecological water flow or recognizing a song line through a site. But it gets deeper into decolonization and driving an awareness that you are on settler land as an indigenous person, and how do you make sure by protocols you're engaging a local custodian, and not just any local custodian, a local custodian that has authority around certain knowledges and the authority to share that knowledge with a non-Aboriginal person. So what I've learned in a lot of my years is, one, I'm definitely in service to it. The best outcome is when it's an Indigenous-led process. So my job as a white male practitioner in this space is, maybe I use my white privilege to open the door, but once my Aboriginal brothers and sisters are in the room, I shut up and they do the talking, because it's not my business. It's their land, their country. And more often than not, I would say 100% of the time that happens, there's tremendous value on the knowledge and wisdom that's shared by that Aboriginal leader in that room of architects and engineers or developers or building owners, on changing the way they think about the role that they have as a built environment practitioner. And there's tremendous value to the project, be it through changing the nature of the architectural response to that site, reconsidering site location, is this a spiritual aspect of the site, and how do we acknowledge that? You know, what's the older geomorphology pre-settlement knowledge of that land that those knowledge keepers have that we wouldn't be able to find in some Western interpretation of that parcel? You know, there's tremendous fertile ground, and I see that it's very nascent, but it's the beginning of this. I hate to use the word renaissance because but I do see this. It's equivocal to what I say is a contemporary renaissance of how Indigenous knowledge is expressed authentically and integrated into a new development in a city. What's important is that I also learned from another white philosopher who used to teach University of Sydney, Glenn Albrecht, and I've shared this with many people have heard me share this. There's a term called solastalgia, which was originally coined by this philosopher to consider the feeling and emotional turmoil of feeling homesick, even though you haven't left your home because your environment's changing so rapidly around you. And it was more to do with terraforming through mining on Aboriginal lands. It was changing the landscape and the visual and spiritual connection to that land. But more and more, as we rapidly urbanize, you know, whether you're Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, you know, there is a sense of lost identity in cities, the way that the speed and rapacity of urbanization around the world, and the shape and drape glass tower that's perpetuated through the globalization of real estate and the speed at which capital is deployed is changing urban landscapes so fast that people are losing their sense of identity. Not only through the urban morphology, but I think through the franchise nature of a ground plan with the Starbucks and banks and everything else that has no cultural context. And then you have to do more than just put up a symbolic piece of art to acknowledge it or a naming. I think there's so much tremendous value in applying Indigenous knowledges to this. I know you edited a book earlier this year, and Chels and I contributed a chapter. Again, she led. You know, I do what I can as a white, you know, male practitioner to interpret as best I can and make sure that knowledge is intact. So it's signed off by my Aboriginal partner. We wrote a book chapter on applying Indigenous knowledge to contemporary response to climate resilient city making, and how that translates into a developer reading that document or somebody else. Where it's probably most progressed, I mentioned earlier, is Aotearoa, New Zealand. You heard Dominique mention language. Language is crucial in this cause. What's beautiful, and the difference in North America, you have many different language groups of First Peoples. In Australia, I believe there's over 500 different language groups. What's special about Aotearoa, New Zealand is you have one language that Maori speak in any iwi, North or South Island. And what's beautiful is Pahia, the non-Maori residents of New Zealand, are learning that language. And that language, I'm observing a shift of consciousness of non-Maori people, because the way that language has multidimensional meanings and relationality, so that you are connected to a river or a mountain as a brother or a sister or an auntie. So that is missing in the Cartesian Western educated mindsets that I inherited growing up in the East Coast of the USA. That kind of split, you know, more often than not, the term nature is not in most First Peoples lexicons, but it is certainly in a Western educated context, in this kind of departure or bifurcation of humans from nature, or humans from wealth. There's also, you can't just kind of think about sticking Indigenous knowledge into a design meeting, right? There's more systemic things at play around how we change the nature of land. I think one transitional step, which we're seeing a lot of progress on across cities, is the role of community land trusts as a bridging legal instrument that changes how land is managed by a community. So more akin, not pure Aboriginal way or Indigenous ways of land governance, but at least a transitional Western legal mechanism that is closer to that. And a huge success is happening in Eureka, California, where the government, this is where it works best, is where the government gives land back to First Peoples. In this case, the Wyatt tribe of Northern California got 270 acres of their own land back that's been remediated, and there's no title restrictions. So they can do with that land as they see fit. And they are developing an Aboriginal or Indigenous-led First Peoples community land trust model. So they are using a Western legal framework with their own cultural lens to conceive of an economic development strategy and community development response for their land. That's how it should be. And we need more of those ways of approaches. It is, if you don't have that opportunity, then, bring in a first person into your design team, the same way that Janine Benyus, who many of you might know from biomimicry, when she started saying you need to have a biologist at the design table. Even more so if you have a Aboriginal, Maori, or Native American biologist or ecologist design table, even better. Because there's a whole level more advanced of thinking around that. And there's a lot of work happening. I will ask Chels if she's okay with sharing, like, the fusion of Western science, Indigenous knowledge coming together. There is common ground that we're seeing, though it's near term, and you'll see a lot of research on this, but it's just, you're at the beginning of this really powerful transition of bioculture restoration and the vital role that First Peoples have in the global narrative of dealing with climate change, social inequality, food, land governance, the hyperlocalization that helps deal with planetary health. I've talked on for a while, so I'll stop talking now. And I'll share a list of links and resources, everything I talked about today, so everyone can have those, because I know we're not sharing. I didn't want to share slides because I think it's important that we just have a dialogue.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic, and I love your story and also your reflection. Let's say on your own learning and your own background and the system that you grew up in, and we all basically grew up in. So yeah, being third grade is already quite advanced, I must say, Jason. So there is a long way to go, but there's also, you did a lot of work, and one thing that you mentioned is of particular interest in this context. I think the word that you used was we as Western people growing up in this education system need this 20 year of unlearning. So you need to get rid of your habits in order to, let's say, open up to other insights that are that you so far not have allowed into your practice.
I'm really glad you brought that up. There's also a really important topic of cultural loading, right? It is very cool to have First Peoples with you on this journey and learning from them. If you have the privilege and gift of befriending, learning from them, being mentored by them, but there's also tremendous burden being placed on them to come to the table now, right? There's with that Renaissance, we're applying Western time concepts and project management and economic pressure, and that should not be the case, right? Like, I've been in rooms hearing this, just being a fly on the wall listening on yarns about the pressure that's unfair. Like, you don't want to bring a Western notion of time and deadlines and things. We have to work according to their principles and lore and law of country, as Dominique mentioned earlier. So there is a deep humbling and respect in ways that I've had to learn how to just navigate and listen and let it go as it needs to go, because it's not my decision, right? I stay out of the decision-making process. I am there to be in service too. And one of the things, it's like a 12-step program for decolonizing the mind. But there's a great resource that we learned. There's a woman named Claire Land, who Dominique probably knows as well, who wrote a great book called Decolonizing Solidarity. And it's a great book. It's technical in nature, but it's basically looking at how non-Indigenous people have in the past failed to support Indigenous causes and support Indigenous rights because they come in with the white savior and non-Indigenous mentality and set up a nonprofit to do something, and they actually push it backwards instead of forwards. So there is a really important way of how you train and develop yourself and learn how to be of value and how to be of service to First Peoples in the world. And we would we would have working groups and little focus groups where I'd be in a room with like 6 other, Australian non-Indigenous people learning from each other, and teaching each other how to do this. So not burdening an Aboriginal person or a Maori person to do that with us, but doing it ourselves. So there's a responsibility that I have to develop myself and way of thinking, and that's through books. Yes, once in a while I have the privilege, if I get permission to, be on a call and listen in, or be directly, I have luxury of that. I have my business partner is an Aboriginal systems ecologist, so I can go to her and have conversations to learn. But that's my responsibility. I'm actively seeking that. I'm developing myself. I'm unlearning my mind. I'm not burdening someone for that. I'm buying my own books. And as a lesson this morning, there's also, financial propositions. Like when I go into a project, usually cultural protocols is first thing we do is have another first person engage with a local custodian so that you're making the right contact in that community that has that protocol and authority to share knowledge. Those are really all understanding that, right? Instead of just kind of knocking on someone's door. And yes, there's probably a financial or gift. Like I usually put myself in service for free, knowing I don't want to be extracting something. There's already been enough extraction and colonization. Like I gift my time and whatever I have, before, I start listening in and just being around. So I have to meet with Dakota families in Minnesota on Saturday, and I'm for free spending my weekends with them, learning about community wealth building models and land trust models that may benefit them. So I'm sharing everything I have for free, and I'm not I'm giving my time to them, so that maybe there's some cultural reciprocity, I can learn from them in the future. But nothing should be considered free, I think.
So Jason, can I just riff off? Can I check that you can hear me?
Yeah. Yep, I hear you great.
So when Jason was talking about, there are a couple of things I wanted to build on, which is in our mindset, if we need an engineer, we go to an engineering company and we get an engineer and the engineer gives us that advice. But if we need a structural or if we need an architect, we don't go to an engineer. We have this mindset that if we need Indigenous consultation, we will bring an Indigenous person in, and any Indigenous person will do. And I was guilty of this, 10 or more years ago. And as Jason said much more eloquently than I'm saying, there is cultural safety that is 2 things. One is an Indigenous person that you bring in, if they're not of the place of which you're bringing them into. So if you're doing a project in New York and you bring an Indigenous person from Australia, they do not have the cultural authority to say anything about that place. They're not of that place. And so that puts them on a huge burden if they're seen in a project as being the advisor of Indigenous stuff, to go back to the New York community and have permission to share knowledge. And often we don't think about that because we have this mindset of if you're this person, we can just engage you and you can just advise us. But it's even more nuanced than that. You could get a New York person, Indigenous person, and you could have them in a New York project, but you could be working on saltwater land instead of freshwater land, and they will not have the cultural stories, the authority to talk about, saltwater land on freshwater land. And so that is why there is that really nuanced conversation if we want to bring people on board to support projects from that First Nations perspective. And so starting from them telling you who the right people are to speak to is really important. Secondly, it isn't just about bringing one person onto a team, because that isn't psychological safety. I've been in the architecture, construction, sustainability engineering field for 30 years. And there's been a lot of times that I've been the only female on a project. And then anything female gets pointed at me. I'm the token, but I'm not listened to. I'm in the picture to show that there's some diversity in there, but I am not accepted as somebody that has knowledge until a second woman joins the group, and then together we have more psychological safety to approach things. And so often we need to think, and I chair boards, I do a lot of governance work, and if I'm trying to build diversity into my governance model, it isn't just about finding the token Asian person or the token non-binary person or the token disabled person. Is actually creating a community of capacity for them to contribute, and that includes psychological safety. So when we're talking to First Nations people, when we're inviting them to walk with us on a project, we need to think about that cultural safety. Do they have the capacity to speak for what you're asking them to speak about? And secondly, do they have the psychological safety? Do they feel supported to not just be the only person sitting there with all of the pressure of representing that thing? So bringing more than one into a conversation. So those are the two things that I just wanted to add on to what you were saying, Jason, because they're really hard-won lessons from my perspective of how I've been just gotten it wrong. I've just gotten it wrong because I had this mindset of, you know, I'm an architect, I need an engineer, I'll go find an engineer, I need an Indigenous person. Oh, any Indigenous person will do. That is so not true and not in the spirit of where we need to be to walk together. There needs to be that understanding of their timeframes, their capacities to contribute.
So if I may ask you a question then, because I think both of you have gone through a pretty long period of trying to understand that context very well. But there's a bunch of people out there in the same kind of roles as you have been in that not even have started this whole process. So what would you advise them to do? Because if it takes them 30 years and you present them here, you need to study for 30 years and then you are in third grade. I can imagine a lot of people that are not intrinsically interested in it, but we need those people as well, because it's maybe 99% of the people that are doing urban development at the moment. So how do we create that enormous shift that is necessary in a somewhat quick way?
Well, yeah,
it's not about time, but it's
sustainability movement. I mean, Dom and I are the generation that had to create, you know, like this. There's like a cottage industry sustainability, right? There wasn't like a title for us 25 years ago. We had to create that and, like, you know, push green building system rating through all these things, through train, educate, and do all that stuff. That generation, there's a generational shift. I don't know if I forget the technology adaptation, or like there's some kind of mathematical term that kind of accelerates diffusion of technology. I see that happening with sustainability. Right, what took me 20 years of reading books and building a global network, kids are getting in like 1 year, 2 years worth of school now. It's all, we didn't have that in K through 12. Right now, it's in there, so you're getting a generational shift in this knowledge. But I would say step one is sign up for the Regenerative Practitioner course. Right, you know, start the 3-month intensive journey to cultivate a new mindset. Right. There's tons of books out there now. There's tons of trainings and connect. Like, I knew enough to come into Minnesota and not come, here's, you know, Jason's view of the world, and this is how you guys should do things in Minneapolis and St. Paul and around your city. It's like, I connected with my, you know, there's what Dominique would so beautifully call the mycelium network. There's a global network of us that have been trained this way. And the crude way to think about it is we're Jedi sustainability practitioners, right? But we're all connected. You know, Daniel's in Mallorca, I have friends in Europe, we have friends all through Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, across the US. And I found a regenerative practitioner in Minnesota. And within 2 days, I was connected to a Dakota elder. And now I get to spend time on country with those family and start to learn and see the landscape of Minnesota through their lens, their history, so their journey, their living culture. it takes time, but there is so much out there now on this topic. If you just Google Indigenous approaches to urbanization or urban planning, you're going to get tons of papers around there. But I also, safeguarding knowledge, I have like Tyson and Auntie Ann Polina and a few others like Chels, where I actually check the authorship of documents and books and make sure that author, that archaeologist or anthropologist or so-and-so is actually interpreting that 2000 generation, or 100,000-year-old living culture knowledge correctly. Right, someone's in there writing a book about the Birima fish traps, which are 42,000 years old in central New South Wales. Are they interpreting that correctly as a Western educated archaeologist, or do they have cultural protocol and the lore of a local custodian in New South Wales to better speak to that? So it's gotten like, now I'm just like, my head is swimming, right? Because I have, Jason grew up in New York, New Jersey, educated, conventional real estate investment and profit, capitalism and all that kind of stuff. And, once you start cracking more and more this new world, this way of thinking and like developing, I say, planetary consciousness, I can't look back the other way, but I'm not fully developed, to do this other stuff. So I rely and need, the wisdom that's sitting around me, I'm reading tons of books. I just bought an incredible book called Total Reset. I don't even know if Dominique knows about that one yet. But there has been a white man named Greg Campbell, and my Auntie Ann Polina sent me an email about this. It was an elder that we learned from in Australia. 30 years, this white man was allowed to meet with a knowledge holder and learn the original knowledge of an Aboriginal community in the Kimberleys, and 30 years was translating this into a 720-page document. It's probably the most advanced book on Aboriginal living culture and knowledge ever written. It just got released as a website, so I can add that to the list here. But like, I bought that right away. I spent $110 on it because I want to contribute to whoever that book, to have it shipped here. Its carbon footprint is going to be high, but hopefully it'll help me teach and reduce that footprint. So I think there's a faster cycle of learning, and we're having this. You're hosting this conversation. You learn with us in Australia, and you're hosting this conversation right now as you're entering into a new area and geography of the world in Mexico, which has incredible Indigenous knowledge and incredible Indigenous history, as does anywhere in Mesoamerica and South America. It's fertile ground, you're going to see so much value in this talk today, and like how it connects you with elders there.
I have a couple of ideas on the how do we not take 30 years to gather knowledge, which is, it's not an either or. It's not leave behind the old Jason, here comes the new Jason. The old Jason comes with the emerging Jason. And the same goes for, so it's not that our Western mindset is bad, it is just too dominant. And it's not that Indigenous knowledge is all good, it is just not found its way to talk together. And what will come out will not be Western, and it won't be Indigenous. It'll be us walking together into whatever that future thing looks like. So it's not an either or, and that's very much of our Western mentality. It's that reductionist. That was bad, so we'll no longer do sustainability, and now we'll do ESG. Oh, now ESG is no longer the in term, so now we'll throw all that away and we'll go regenerative. But it isn't. It's a cumulative growing. And as Jason said, we are relearning that Indigenous knowledge. But it's not, there are things that aren't working for us, and we should learn from those and be honest with those, and then have those conversations with our Indigenous mentors to work out, well, what's a better, more appropriate way of addressing the issues that are not being addressed well. But to say now how to do this very simply. Okay, so the reason that we keep talking about going back to regenerative development as a conceptual framework that helps us Westerners to understand Indigenous thinking is that that is one of the frameworks that's really trying to encapsulate that approach, that more ecological way of thinking. And to give you a very, very simple way of doing this is I use the give a man a fish analogy. All right, so we all know that, and so if I degender it, give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day, and then the next one is teach them how to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. Well, they'll eat for a lifetime until the fish run out, okay? Because all you've taught them is that what's important is fishing. Right? So what does a regenerative way of looking at this issue look like? It is teach them to love the ocean, right? So it's not saying don't fish. It's not giving a fish. It's saying understand the system that you are a part of, and then it is your decision of how you care for that place because you love it. When you love a place, you care for it. And so when you're asking that fundamental and really important question about how do we start this journey right now, it is start shifting your mindset to thinking about how do I create that capacity to care for that street, that park, that shopping centre, that community, that school. Those are the questions that will bring out the wisdom of the place, of the people, on what you can do there.
Well, I think that, yeah, that's, it crossed my mind that Jason's head is swimming and you ask him to love the ocean. So I think there is a synergy there in one go. But let me go to some questions of the audience to you. And the first question is from Nava Saberi, and I think Nava is from Iran, so she's in a very particular context, I think. And she wants to ask you in what way do you think we can build trust with the Indigenous people when we start working with them in so many different levels, because in planning and design, but also in many other levels. So where does that start and how can you work together with them and how should you approach that? Do you have a response to that?
I'll just spend 1 minute, which is start humbly, understand the cultural position that they're in, create psychological safety, and really be aware and give them permission to let you know if they're feeling uncomfortable, if something's not working, and work through that. And be careful of timeline, because it takes time if you have to go back to the knowledge holders of various aspects to get permission to speak about things. It takes time to think and listen to the country, to observe what's going on, to really bring that knowledge. So time, cultural safety, psychological safety, and humbleness.
I say, I'll use my entry. So how I practice and learn to practice in Australia. I brought that mentality with me to the Gulf region, the Middle East, right? But before expat Jason could show up and say, this is how you can transform your economy in cities and decarbonize, I spent months reading the whole history of the region, British impact, American impact, oil, natural resources, wealth, cultural identity, faith. And the first people I talked to were archaeologists that had a deep knowledge in the origins of that place and the tribal nomadicism and the history of the families, all that kind of stuff. And then I befriended a colleague who taught at the College of Islamic Studies, and I started learning Islam and understanding faith and the connection and touch points of sustainability within the Quran and the touch points of climate change into Quran and Arabic and Islamic lenses. So they're interpreting it through their lens. And this is an interesting one because it was, you have direct and indirect colonization, right? You have here in the Middle East, you have a lot of ruling families, better for worse, that own their land, right? They govern their own states over there. But they have a very colonized urban landscape in that they've imported what I call billboard urbanism, right? It's like, like, oh, glass towers, boom, just crash, that have no cultural context. And when I talked about like losing urban identity, Doha, in the urbanity of Doha, is almost 100% built in the last 20 years. Like in less than one lifetime, your entire country was built up around you. So imagine elders there and like all this, like the psychological impact of that. So it was reconnecting that there's more value in coming at a cultural driven response to urbanity there, whether it was dealing with water, how do you deal with urbanization in a dry desert climate? So it's helping reconnect the value of their culture, their practices, their historic knowledges, learning from their elders how to rethink their country, their economy. Like it was, and that took me months and months of like, they're so like, what would you do? How would you do it? How would you do it in America? And it's like, no. How would you do it through your own lens? How would you do it like in that? So that it was more about that. I would say, again, you mentioned building trust. Dominique and I have trained in regenerative practitioner learning, and like that gives us, we've learned a language, a way of thinking, a way of practicing that has afforded us an ability to engage with First Peoples and connect with them and communicate with them maybe a little differently than others that have been trained. There's still a lot for us to learn, but how I met Chels was I got an email from my wife because my wife knows I'm super passionate about First Peoples culture and knowledges. And so, my colleague was giving a talk at the Natural History Museum in Sydney, and I emailed her before the talk and said, hey, my name's Jason, and kind of a little bit about where I'm coming from, so she knows my intentions and I want to meet with her. But she thought I was stalking her. Like, who's this white dude stalking me? Until we had a coffee. And well, what I did is I offered her a paid role, right? So I got her involved in a huge project and a contract, so her knowledge could be brought to bear on this huge urban regeneration project, right? So there was a gift, like I've got, there's a contract, there's some money, you're going to get some money. She still didn't trust me and where I was coming from. And then we had coffee one morning, and I became vulnerable, shared my story, why I care about this topic. This is also something I've learned from First Peoples. So being very open and honest about who I am, the life experiences that shape the way I see the world and how I live in the world, so they can see all of me and deeply into me about who I am as a person and my intentions. And she cried, I cried, we hugged, and the rest is history. So Dominique and I were also, you came to Naituhoi, right?
Yeah.
So we both were very privileged that 100 of us were invited to spend a week with an incredibly beautiful tribe in Iwi in the North Island of New Zealand. And again, when we connect on an Iwi and First Peoples, there's a marae, there's a welcoming ceremony. And a lot of it is, there's a lot of conversation about where you're from, your lineage, your mother, your father, your river, your mountain, where you come from, life experiences that shaped you and you are, before you sit down and have a business conversation, right? Westerners are very like, Americans will just go into a meeting. Okay, what's the agenda? It's not like, how's your family? How's your children? Like, it's seeing beyond the facade of our work lives and our full potential and our full being, right? And then you can talk about stuff. So
they're learning to love us. They're learning to love us, and we need to learn to love them. And that's that very different mindset. If you just walk in and go, "What's the agenda? Let's go," and you don't know each other, and you don't know you don't know how to support each other. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's exactly right. But that's how my personal experience have been able to earn trust and integrity. And it's a starting point every time. Like this weekend, I'm going to drive down 4 hours and stay with the Dakota family. I have no vested interests. I have no financial connection. I have nothing to gain other than to know them and be of value to them and service to them and earn their trust over time. It takes time. so that they know where you're coming from. You can imagine, you know, several hundred years of colonization and atrocities and stolen land and all these other things. There's trauma. There's a lot of trauma. And, you know, we have to come at this with integrity, authenticity, and no agenda, as Dominique just said.
Great. Maybe it's time, Dominique, do you want to answer the question of Miriam, talking about Christopher Alexander and his history? Do you want to reflect on that?
So one of the practices that I think Christopher's work, as well as some later people around the New York way, led into is both the idea of the need of ecology in our neighbourhoods, but also the need of placemaking. Now, placemaking can sometimes be seen as kind of place wash and trying to gentrify, but the true intention of that localization, that placemaking, is that connecting people to place, thinking at a small scale, thinking about the patterns of place, and having the people of that place work with you on sort of patterns of understanding place. Because when you are connecting people to having some agency over the place where they live, and you appreciate and acknowledge their knowledge of that place, and you start listening to what they think will help the place thrive, and you base your design on that, then not only are you getting a more appropriate design for place, but you're getting a whole lot of people that feel like they've been listened to, that they are connected. And when I say listen to the wisdom of place, it's not just of you know, the wealthy shop owner people, but you also want to listen to the elderly, the disabled, the children, but you also want to listen to the nature of the place. And that's where understanding some of that geology, the hydrology, and bringing the stories that Indigenous people speak about the place will also bring in that wisdom. But connect people to place, teach them to love through supporting them to have agency. If we have time, I'll talk to the Paddock project, but if we don't have time, I will send the link to you. But that's a project where we designed a development that was a for-profit development to bring back 5 species. I won't go into more detail unless we have time later on, but we brought back 5 species as well as creating a for-profit housing development that dealt with a whole lot of social and other aspects.
I think Dominique.
Stuff to this?
Oh yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I love Chris Alexander, and I love Maggie, his wife, and I love the lineage of people that he's trained across the world. He's had a profound influence on me, and I'm glad someone brought it up on this chat. I've taught, if you learn from me, Rob knows, at any class I've taught in university, you're going to learn Jane Jacobs and you're going to learn Chris Alexander. And I make the students. So I got into Chris's work very early on and read, you know, notes on the synthesis of form all the way to Nature of Order. And I know 2 of my closest friends helped write Nature of Order, so I've learned directly with them. And I've had the privilege of spending a week in Chris's house in Sussex, England, a few years back while he was writing The Battle. And I just gave a eulogy for him last year in his passing. So he's left a profound legacy in his work. So pattern language is with me everywhere I go. And the way I describe Chris's impact on me as a practitioner is he taught me how to feel the built environment and have that emotional connection when we're considering designing places, homes, doorknobs, windows, child's places. And but the most important one, I always was drawn to, my entry point into why I do what I do was very much about teenage society and apprenticeships and all that kind of stuff. So I've kind of brought that sociological wave that Chris talked about, teenage society and a place for them outside of the direct authority of the parents when they're kind of learning boundaries and authority in the world. That always comes to play on every project I've been on since I learned that kind of stuff. But yeah, I love Chris's work.
Oh, fantastic. So it comes all together, I guess. Dominique, I think we've got like 10 minutes left in the webinar. So if you want to talk about the Paddock project, I think it's a very, very interesting and great project. So very worthwhile for people to listen to you.
Okay, great. And Jason, feel free to jump in if you have aligned projects. But this was a project where, firstly, the architect had his office on the site for a couple of years. So he knew the site from actually living on the site. The area of the site is near Castlemaine in about an hour and a half from Melbourne in Australia. And it used to be sort of grassland and trees, and Indigenous people would travel through it, and they were part of that landscape, but it was never a place of ongoing community because there isn't a lot of water there. But anyway, aside from that, it's right at the end of the Murray, right at the end of all of their tributaries. But having said that, so it's quite dry. But then they found gold. When white man came, they found gold, and then they stripped all of the trees, stripped all of the soil, changed the whole hydrology. And on this site, it was not recognisable back to what it was before white man. Then farming came along and did the farming thing, and then the people who bought the land started to restore it, planting trees and so forth. But then it became boundary in the city, the part of the city boundary, so it was to become developed. And we looked at the other developments around, which were big houses all together, very little gardens, just lots of roads to people to get to their houses. And we wanted to do something different. And we were aligning it to the Living Building Challenge at the time. COVID's messed with the capacity to meet that challenge, but that was what we were designing to. And the first thing that we did was an ecological survey of the site. So across 3 seasons, we looked at what's the soil doing, what's the water doing, what are the microorganisms, what is the ecological pathways that travel through this. And we brought all of that together. And the wonderful landscape architects worked with that and created ecosystems that would bring back the flows, that would encourage the golden sun moth, the powerful owl, the legless lizard, the growling grass frog, and the little sugar glider, which is a little possum that flies between trees, to come back to this site. And once we had designed those ecosystems, we then designed the homes, and the homes are in 4 blocks. Between those blocks are views into the site. But that's when we're talking, so that's all of the physical stuff. So the house is a Living Building Challenge, they're healthy, local materials, involving local builders, and so creating local economy, but that's still all of the physical stuff. What's really important within what we're talking about and things in nature is to create that love of place, that connection, that agency, the belonging, and all of the things that we've been talking about. So how do we do that? Is we pass on the story of the intention of the place. So I go there every year, I give a chat about the fact that we're trying to bring back these species, and the people who are now moving in there are becoming custodians of that story. So they are learning which are the right grasses to plant and which ones are the weeds they can bring out. They are sending me photos when an animal comes along. But not only that, each of the views into the site has a different story. So we have the Indigenous history side, we have and of course they're still there. So the Indigenous view in, we have the gold rush view in, we have the mining view in, we have the agricultural view in, and then we've got the current quirky academic foodie view in. That's the intention of those views in, but it's up to the community to curate what that looks like. So they get to have discussions around the history, those 5 layers of history of the place, and they get to design the plants, the artworks, and so forth. And of course, we've got enough food growing places for everyone. We've got chickens and we've got bees, and there's and this is all on the same site that you would have put the same 28 houses, yet we have created so much more because of it. And through COVID, the first phase of development was open through COVID. The people talk about the fact that they actually thrived because they were together as a community. They felt part of a place. They felt belonging and attachment together. They supported each other. There's so much more to this, and I'll share some links with it. But that's the capacity that we have in development. And I know Jason's worked on some amazing projects that do even more than what I'm talking about. But it's just about thinking, how can what we do, whatever development, whether it's a train station, a school, or a housing development, what can we do to bring back health and vitality and capacity, both ecologically to bring the stuff back, but also socially to bring our hearts back to create thriving together.
I think there's going to be some in the Connecting to Country framework on the link that I shared on the chat. You're going to see a series of case studies come out at the macro scale, like well, some are like urban response centers and urban recreational parks that are much more performance landscaping, as if Aboriginal led kind of land management practices, to like mosaic burning and like the great work of Victor Stephan and the retraining, how to deal with bushfire responses and planning how to mitigate that through coal mosaic cultural burns. Again, the protocols around that are really crucial. But I do know that every square inch of Australia was managed to a T. And in doing practices, and one of the key things that Dominique and would be aware of is the nature of 7 seasons. There's like a Gregorian calendar that was brought to bear in Australia when most Aboriginal families around the language groups in Australia were using a 7-season calendar because it was so dialed down to the day and the minute that authority had the right to burn this area, and that crossed over into other territories, but song lines were used to reconnect all that. So there's so much. The governance is so crucial. So any project I've worked on, and the one outside of Australia and the capital of Canberra, there's so much focus on governance when looking at the cultural and behavioral dimensions. So it's not just the physical urbanity or physical response community development. It's the governance you put in place and the cultural and behavioral nuances of addressing climate change, sustainability, water, land, other species. And the other powerful thing I learned in these projects is the term equity. When I think of equity as a dude from New York, I'm thinking about affordable housing or affordable food. I learned equity is for all living species, right? The right for a bird, and you just heard, Dominique mentioned a project where she listed off like few flora and fauna that, typically would, not get discussed. Maybe the ecologist would raise something in the ecology report or environmental report, but actually designing a site to ensure a regenerative outcome for a moth or a butterfly or a salamander or a species of tree or flora, and that you design the human settlement around that, right? It's reversing the planning paradigm where you kind of ask this question, what's working for life in this place first and foremost, and usually from a local custodian who has knowledge of that place. And then starting to cultivate a design response in a way that humans can settle in that area that isn't degenerating those life systems and species that are already there, right? So it's a regenerative intervention kind of thing. That flips the urban paradigm on its head when you start to ask that. And we've been practicing using a term life-centered design because we're so anthropocentric and our cities are so human driven. It's all about what we need, how we get around, how we work, how we feed ourselves, how we let our children run outside, like without thinking about the birds and the bees and the species and everything else. So yes, you see pollination corridors cropping up. Yes, you see living infrastructure and the role of trees being a vital economic role in cities, but it's still very nascent. It's not deep at a level deep yet or advanced as it would be if Aboriginal-led strategies were really put at the core of urban development models.
I think this is nearing a close because you're drawing a conclusion, I think, out of this conversation that is really, really essential. And instead of putting humans first, putting the city first, before we create a city, we need to put the landscape, life in its broadest sense, at the forefront of our thinking. And of course, that is a a learning process. It is not something that there's not a recipe for. You both shared links and background information, so we'll pass that on to all the viewers that have viewed the webinar, of course. But I think one of the things is also very important that you both are mentioning. This is a process of endless learning. You start with it, and then the learning continues and continues and continues, and it will never stop. And I hope that with this seminar, we have sparked also the curiosity of all the viewers in this kind of thinking, this way of approaching the next step in what we are doing on this planet. And therefore, I think this has been wonderful. I would like to thank you both for your time and your inspirational talks that you and thoughts that you gave and shared with us. A little bit special for Dominique because she had to get up so early in the morning to be with us, and I hope there's a lot of people from Australia also watching because we try to manage the time. But thank you, both of you, for your time and your fantastic stories. This brings us to a close of the webinar. The only thing that remains is to mention to all of you that we will have a next Urban Dialogue in a month's time, 24th of May, on the topic of water, or in some places the lack thereof, related to the city and urban development. So I hope you will all be watching again and share our thoughts and bring this ecologically based and indigenous driven kind of thinking further. So thank you all.